Welcome to Defiant Nation Radio, where we defy the narrative that our culture is feeding us. We defy the idea that the scriptures cannot be trusted, and we defy the idea that the God of the Bible does not exist. We defy the idea that we have evolved from monkeys. At Defiant Nation Radio, we uphold the solas of the Reformation. We uphold the scriptures. We believe that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Defiant Nation Radio is the podcast ministry of EternityAtStake.com.
All right, so welcome to part 3. Welcome to Defiant Nation Radio. We are in a series called With Socialism Comes Violence. We've been talking about, went through Proverbs a little bit, talking about wisdom and God's call for us to seek His wisdom, talking about violence in the news, talked about the socialistic and the calls for violence that is organic in the thought process, but then also the instigated violence that is called for both in the past and present day. We talked about Saul Alinsky and his rules for radicals in part 2. And so now we're in part 3, and I want to talk about Antifa and give you a little bit of the history. I've got to help understand some terminology because this, as I began to understand these topics better, I could understand, okay, what is Antifa? What is, in comparison, so Antifa supposedly stands for anti-fascist. Well, the Antifa was a communist group started by Trotsky back in the early 1900s. He's the one that led the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia to take over Russia. So Antifa has been around for over 100 years. And if you can track, some of the symbols that they're using today, you can go back and see footage and see those same symbols used back then. The Nazis today would be, the KKK, the neo-Nazis, brown shirts, things like that. So Trotsky set up Antifa to fight Nazis and fascists, okay? So these guys all have the same underlying ideology, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, but then you branch off into communism, into Nazism, into fascism, and so there's these schisms in their socialistic views, but they're fighting. So they would roam the streets and they would beat the living daylights out of each other, and but I wanted to give you some of that breakdown because Antifa, they hate the Nazis, but they're communists. They are communists. And so, but then they're also labeling everyone as Nazis. So then in their minds, and for the average person, we hate Nazis too. So they're punching Nazis, right? The call to punch Nazis, if you've heard them talking about that. Trevor Loudon did a phenomenal documentary called Antifa Exposed. You can go to his website. I'll have a link for that on here. Antifa Exposed, and track through their history. I'm gonna give you some of that history that he gives and a few other sources here. But also check out the website Discover the Networks. They have got phenomenal connections. If you need to see these connections for your own understanding, for other people's understanding, you write papers or whatever, check out the website, Discover the Network. So let me start by giving you some of the information Trevor talks about. Watch Antifa Exposed. It should be, I think it's still free on his website, free on YouTube. Check it out, okay? It's like 30 minutes. You'll be so thankful you did because you'll be a little bit wiser as you come away from it. But you might have heard of Black Bloc, BLAC. They were from the early 2000s. They were a radical group that we now know as Antifa. Well, they go back 100 years, so let me kind of give you some of that history. They were originally protesting the Iraq War through violence and property destruction and so on and so forth. But with extreme groups like Antifa, the neo-Nazis, the KKK, we hear that the police are refusing to step in. And several of the events that have been used by even evangelical left to bash evangelical Christians that are conservative, that are right-leaning, right? Are events like Charlotte, North Carolina, where the riots. There were racist KKK, Antifa, Black Lives Matter groups. They were protesting each other, the removal of a statue. There were some people there that weren't connected with any of these radical groups, and CNN doctored a video from Trump that made it look like he was saying that the racists were good people there. When you go back, you watch the whole video clip, and it's not. As a matter of fact, one of their guys actually came out and admitted that he didn't say they were racist. And so that if that's stuck in your brain, you need to understand the whole context here. But in that Charlotte, North Carolina, and those riots there where the lady was killed, many people were beaten, sent to the hospital. The police, and Trevor mentions it in his video. I've got a link to an LA Times article, an Atlantic report on this. The police were actually involved in pushing the groups together to foment the war going on. And so it appears that this was really a staged photo op to push the Trump's a bad guy movement. So got to be aware of what's going on. But the claim is that Antifa is anti-fascist. They hate Nazis. It's still socialism, but it is the communist brand. It actually comes from what happened in Italy and other factions of socialist countries in the 1920s. So let me give you some of this history. You had the fascists, the Nazis, the communists. They're all fighting each other. These tactics would later spill into the labor unions in America as pro-communist union members fought with anti-communist union members. Leon Trotsky's formed this. I'm kind of reading through some of my notes. The Antifa groups were actually growing in Germany until Hitler took power, where the brown shirts were able to overcome Antifa. And F.A. Hayek, I've read some of his stuff before in his book, The Road to Serfdom. He notes this about the fighting between Antifa and the communists and the Nazis, the brown shirts. He says, it is true, of course, that in Germany before 1933 and in Italy before 1922, communists and Nazis or fascists clashed more frequently with each other than with other parties. They competed for the support of the same type of mind and reserved for each other the hatred of the heretic. But their practice showed how closely they're related. To both, the real enemy, which was the man with whom they had nothing in common with, whom they could not hope to convince, is the liberal of the old type. Now listen to this. While to the Nazi, the communist, to the communist, the Nazi, and to both the socialist are potential recruits. They're made of the right timber, although they have listened to false prophets. They both know that there can be no compromise between them and those who really believe in individual freedom. So the Nazis stopped Trotsky's Antifa shock troops, and many of them easily converted to the Nazi party. Loudon recounts that probably over 50% of the brown shirts were former Antifa members. They were former communists from Trotsky. They were called beefsteak Nazis. They were brown on the outside and red on the inside. Their next iteration in Germany came then in the 1980s as they protested Ronald Reagan, and they called themselves the Anonymous. Loudon notes that Antifa, the communists who hated the fascist Nazis, they rose up again in the 90s and they called themselves the Anti-Nazi League to combat the Nazis that had begun to rise again. Remember, they're very good at changing their name, rebranding a little bit, and just it's the same thing over and over and over through history. We see this happening in our schools and all the philosophies being taught there. For Antifa, they're not just fighting the fascist Nazis, they're also fighting anyone who's against their brand of socialism. German intelligence, this is from Trevor Loudon, I got a screenshot that I'll show you. German intelligence reports, they note that Antifa is fighting also against the capitalist system and its fascist roots. Here's what it says in the German intelligence report. It says left-wing extremists' activities in that context are only superficially directed at fighting right-wing extremist efforts. In fact, the true focus is on fighting the free democratic basic order, which is defamed as a capitalist system and whose allegedly innate fascist roots are to be eliminated. So they are fighting against capitalism. They are fighting against the West. They are fighting against anything that is not for socialist control, the control of the state. Antifa has regrown throughout Germany and greater Europe. There are whole towns that are devoted to communism and are known as Antifa-ruled towns. Towns you are not even allowed into if you're not Antifa. Many of the Antifa movements in America came from the anarchist movement. They want complete lawlessness. But Paul tells us clearly in the book of Romans that God established governments to rule over people, to punish wrong, to promote, to uphold what is right. And the word right and wrong only have context in if the Bible is true. Without the Bible, there's no ultimate authority, and there's no one who determines what is right and wrong. Every single person determines what's right and wrong, and as you think about that, you can see the lunacy in that. But every other religion falls on its face, trying to promote a deity or belief system that cannot fully account for the problems and solutions in the world. Socialism is just another one of those belief systems. Now, let me bring in Bill Ayers and the Weather Underground. Bill Ayers connected with Antifa, okay? Let me give you a little bit of their history. Bill Ayers, Bernadine Dorn, they were infiltrated by an FBI agent, Larry Grathwohl, who was originally, the Weather Underground was originally called the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, in the 1970s. Bill Ayers was a professor at Chicago University, or in Chicago, I don't remember if it was at Chicago University or not, but he mentored Barack Obama in the ways of Saul Alinsky and his rules for radicals in his community organizing. Obama actually started his political campaign in the living room of Bill Ayers. Now, let me help you understand a little bit more about Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers is a convicted terrorist, bombed places, police stations, Pentagon. Today he writes curriculum for our schools. Did you hear me? Today, Bill Ayers, a convicted terrorist, socialist, promoting violence, writes curriculum for our schools. First of all, he should be in jail. Secondly, he should be run out of the building for being who he is. But as we find, more and more of our book writers, authors for schools, curriculum authors are socialists through and through. He's also a part of an organization called Refuse Fascism, which is linked to the Communist Party. And there's a picture of Barack Obama and Bill Ayers working together in article 1925-1997, publication of the Chicago Maroon. In an article on Refuse Fascism's website from 2017 by David Hoberg called "Communists Funding the Resistance: The Alliance for Global Justice," David points out that the communists are funding these movements. All of this tracks back to George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. I mentioned George Soros. George Soros is funding the ERLC that is run by Russell Moore and the Evangelical Immigration Table. Same group. George Soros is fomenting violence. Bill Ayers, Weather Underground, getting money from George Soros, being funded by this. There's an Antifa group in Florida called Knights for Socialism, controlled by the Democratic Socialists of America. Again, these are all connections with Antifa, with Bill Ayers. They're very good at these small pop-up organizations that have, part of the bigger parent organization. Big connections we're seeing between the Democratic Party and Antifa. And Trevor Loudon exposes that they're funded by big money very well in his video. Another group, I'm not going to get into them now, but called BAMN, B-A-M-N, stands for By Any Means Necessary, shows that Antifa is working closely with the Democratic-controlled city councils of many of these cities. This segment, a little bit shorter, but I wanted to get through this call for violence, this push for violence, and this history then of it throughout the world and then coming into America. So first we talked about Proverbs and the call for us to listen to wisdom, the call for us to not listen to the sinners, to not listen to the evil ones, those who are calling for us to wait in secret to shed blood. And that's what's being done over and over and over again. Sometimes it's state sanctioned, sometimes it's run on a local level. Doesn't matter. It's the same. It's the same thing. And God calls us to be dealing with this stuff with wisdom and be shunning the evil man and evil deeds. Right? The fruit of the Spirit. We come back to the fruit of the Spirit. What are those things? The things we should be doing. And then we talked about violence in the news, talked about the socialism and Marxist call for violence. I then talked about Saul Alinsky, his rules for radicals, and about Antifa, Bill Ayers, and so on and so forth. So just a little bit of a summation, but I wanted to put this all together in this series called With Socialism Comes Violence, so that we can understand better what is going on and how we should be dealing with this with our Christian worldview. So hopefully you're able to take this information in, talk about it with your family, talk about it with your friends, and be better informed to understand how this is attacking us and what to watch out for. So anyways, hope you have a great day. Again, check out our website, angryapes.com, if you get a chance. Just a little support, a little chance to support us if you want. But have a great day, and I will talk to you later. Go and serve your King. Keep your eyes on Him in this crazy, messed up, and dark world, because He is the true light. Have a great day.
If you're interested in learning more, preparing yourself better to witness, go to the website eternityatstake.com. We have several series on there. One of them is Maps from the Ancients. It covers manuscripts, archaeology, prophecy, science, and the resurrection. How do we know the Bible can be trusted? It's great for homeschool study, great for a Sunday school class, great for an adult or teen class as well. We also have the Light Project, where I look at 8 cults and world religions, examining them. What do they do with God, with Christ, with the Bible, with salvation, heaven, hell, and things like that? Check it out today. Thanks for listening.